So let's take a little time and talk about The Grapes of Wrath here. Um, this film is significant in a lot of ways. The reading that is assigned for this module is 43 through 156, basically section 2 and 3 of your film book. Um, Kind of hard to overstate how important it is for you to cover this material because Um, it covers the silent era. It really gives you an idea of what the studio system is all about. And it goes into quite a bit of depth regarding the censorship of film, the self censorship, and the censorship battles. Everything from the mutual decision through the creation of the motion picture, the MPAA censorship board, and the attempt midway to sort of self-censorship, the do's and don'ts and be careful of list. Um, and this censorship battle, this odd reality that the Supreme Court creates, in which, really from a position of classism, considers film to be something that is not protected under the First Amendment, and therefore can be censored. The reality of what is created is that in order to protect themselves against the possibility of being closed down in various cities for various reasons, um, the Motion Picture Association of America creates a self censoring board, primarily overseen by people who are Catholic. Uh, um, well, I don't think priest is exactly the word. I'd have to double check exactly what his role, what his original position was. But they turned to the to Catholic bishops. They turned to the Catholic authorities as well as prominent Catholics in the United States who are in banking as a means of getting of a feeling for what will and will not fly with the Catholic community, particularly in the larger cities, because the Catholic communities were so well organized, they were capable of shutting down a picture. And so rather than fight these battles on individual battlegrounds, one set of cases in Chicago, one set of cases in Ohio, as was the case with the mutual decision, by creating this self censoring board, they essentially do it themselves, and then uh, it's everybody gets the same product, and then the theory went nobody would individually fight against it. So it sort of it directed that power of particularly the Catholic clergy's um, desire to not see particular things in movies. It gave them sort of a place to direct that power on a national level, and therefore films could be vetted, and once they came out the door, they were good to go. This really created a disastrous consequences, one could argue, for the motion picture industry, particularly uh, post World War II. And so, and that's what leads us to um, the rating system that was ultimately created so that there were such things as R-rated pictures, because prior to the 1960s, everything pretty much had to be G-rated. And that cut the motion picture industry out of a lot of material. And to a large extent, it's one of the reasons that the theater did so well in the 1940s and 1950s, even though it was in competition with the motion picture industry and then later television, because there just was adult content. And by adult content, I don't mean like pornography, but adult content, which most of you, anything above PG 13, you just couldn't see it. You couldn't see it in the film. And so that created a market for adult content drama that could be taken up by the theater, and the box office of the of film actually stagnated to a degree, and it became such a problem that ultimately they addressed it with the tiered rating system and created R and later even NC-17 and so forth. So Grapes of Wrath, in some ways, is a victim of this, in the sense that there are significant differences between the film version and the novel, even though it is a classic, and certainly nothing in the novel would be considered pornographic or highly sexual. There is violence in the novel, and there are politics, and there is a degree of nudity, I guess, if you want to think about it that way. Rosa Sharon in the novel nurses because she has had a baby which was born dead in the novel, but she still has milk in her breasts as she breastfeeds a starving man in the novel, and in the play version that was on Broadway later, much later. But you do not see that in the film. You do not see her giving birth to a dead child in the film. You do not hear several mentions of regarding the landowner and the I guess it's the gentleman in the campground who's talking about the Reds, quote unquote. Some of his comments are a little broader than in the book than they are in the film, giving indication that really Steinbeck's feeling about what these people thought of as communists were pretty much anybody that wanted to improve their working conditions were considered communists, and that was backed off in the movie so as to not offend people who were, at the time, there was quite a bit of anti-communist sentiment in the country prior to World War II. It sort of took a hiatus during World War II because the Russians were fighting on our side. Took up again, obviously, in the 1950s in a drastic way, particularly in the motion picture industry. So we see these things played out in what is otherwise a beautifully realized version of the novel. John Ford won an Academy Award for it. The screenwriting is terrific. There's a few places that it gets a little sticky. I think that particularly the depictions of the sort of quote unquote clean camp, the good government camp, that's borders on propaganda to a certain extent. I think people look at it now and kind of go, "Oh, it's a little over the top." But again, the acting particularly is extremely solid. Um, uh, Henry Ford does a really beautiful job in his depiction, and I think overall, or rather Henry Fonda, um, I think you see the beginnings in this film of moving in the direction of the kind of acting that we start to later take for granted in films like On the Waterfront and um, Streetcar Named Desire. And thinking of Marlon Brando, particularly his work, and James Dean, and a kind of acting that isn't as presentational as a lot of the early film acting would have been. There's still some vestiges of that, particularly in some of the older actors in the film, and it's good to see those performances side by side. Um, in terms of the cinematography, it's unapologetically dark at times, and that's kind of wonderful to see. Echoes more of a hard-boiled filmmaking style that you might see in a film like Little Caesar or Scarface, or some of the mafia films of the early 1930s, where they were again fighting against the censorship and kind of defying it to a certain extent. paid a price for it in some cases. The motion picture code, fighting against the 1930 motion picture code, and because this sort of the motion picture code not only dictated a lot of what could be done in terms of what you could say, what you could present literally in terms of sexual content, etc. But the censorship was also, just sort of prevented you from creating certain sort of moods to a certain extent. I mean, you could film your film any way you wanted it, but uh, the censors were often sort of opaque about why it was that they were, turning down a picture. One picture might have one piece of content and then filmed a certain way, and then another film would have it filmed in a brighter, saucier, overexposed sort of way, and that would be fine, and the darker would be not fine. And so, what we get, in a sense, these studio pictures become very kind of homogen. The word I'm looking for is sort of homogeneous in their blown out kind of over the top kind of slightly over the top kind of acting, up endings. It became kind of cookie cutter to a large extent, and again, that ultimately worked against the industry in the late 1940s and early 1950s, particularly when people just were back from World War II and wanted something with more depth. They were ready for more honesty. The whole country was coming to grips with a lot of things in a much more honest way than it had prior to World War II, and that was due to a lot of different things. There's also and you'll read about this in the book, quite a bit of a religious quote or sort of social conflict going on between the sort of Protestant sensibility, the Jewish sensibility, and the Catholic sensibility, in the sense that, and it even mentions this in the book, that there was a sort of joke to a certain extent that the films were being financed by Protestant money, managed by Jews, and then censored by Catholics. And this is obviously a broad oversimplification of the situation, but on some levels, not completely wrong, in the sense that the exhibitors of films and many of the people that were pioneers in early motion picture making were Jewish, and the industry remained a place where people from the Jewish community could work successfully and achieve great heights regardless of their religion. Of course, this is at a time when Jews were not even allowed to attend Ivy League institutions in the United States. So there was still a lot of institutional not really racism, but religious persecution, if you would, of people who were Jewish in the United States. And here was a part of the world that Jews could move into and be extremely successful. And again, I'm speaking in sort of broad general terms. Obviously, Jewish people were successful in many things in the United States, but this is definitely one area. The entertainment industry was an area where there were a lot of folks that had a Jewish background and were very successful, particularly in the management of films, directors and actors, etc. Far greater percentage than would the general population. That said, a lot of the old money and a lot of the old banking money in America had and was still held by Protestant interests, and yet these urban centers where films could make a lot of money and become very popular and get a lot of press were in areas that were predominantly Catholic. And so these three radically different sort of sensibilities in some ways as to what people would tolerate seeing, and also this sort of There was a lot of, I would say, classism, not really racism so much as, but that existed to a large extent too. But this perception among people who had power and money that uh, people couldn't be trusted to watch movies and not emulate any bad thing they saw or bad behavior. And this was literally uh, written as a part of the Supreme Court decision in the Mutual case. So it's a fascinating thing to take a look at in terms of what people's perceptions of the film audience are, and you see echoes of this today. Um, People were frequently blaming motion pictures for certain tragedies that take place that may or may not have any correlation to the material in a film. And recently, in fact, fairly recently, we see this with uh, the uh, the horrible shootings in the at the premiere of The Dark Knight. That which certainly that film was not remarkable in its violence any more than any bajillion other films, and yet immediately there was associations made that the content of the film somehow had, some kind of connection to this lunatic's actions. So this is sort of baked into the pie of America's dealing with motion pictures, and we're going to be tracking this over the course of the semester because it deeply affects how motion pictures are made and who makes them. Um, and as auteur directors evolve, the reason that they evolve is because they are the ones that are able to sort of break this deadlock of stagnation within the movie going audience and get people back to the theaters. Um, so ultimately, film is a marriage of art and commerce in an incredible way. Most art is, theater certainly is, uh, visual art to a certain extent. Certainly, obviously, people need to be paid for their art, or else they have to do something else, and that tends to take a lot of their time, and then they can't be working as artists. So, money always factors into art. But when you look at what it takes to create a motion picture in terms of money, and actually now it's easier than it used to be in terms of financing a picture, putting a picture together, because the technology has evolved, digital technology particularly. Um, but really, when I first started working in the motion picture industry in the early 90s, you really had to make a movie on film, and you pretty much had to make it on 35 millimeter film, although some people were making Super 16s and getting away with it at film festivals, etc. The idea that you could use high-end video was just not really. You couldn't even submit that to most film festivals. You had to have a print, and uh, that was cost prohibitive, and it created immediately um, uh, a nexus between the creative people, the filmmakers, the writers, the directors, etc., and people who could finance a picture. And those people that financed the picture, their sensibilities had to be taken into account. You just didn't make movies in a vacuum. And so you take somebody like Steven Spielberg, who you would think could just make any movie that he would want to make, and yet his recent film Lincoln took years and years. Some people, I've heard a story, I'm not sure if it's even true, that it took 10 years to develop Lincoln, which it's a good film, but it didn't take 10 years to develop it from a creative standpoint. It took 10 years to bring it to market because it was still an expensive film to make. And to think that it takes that long for Steven Spielberg to marshal the resources to create a film which in some ways was, not incredibly remarkable in terms of its special effects. It wasn't exactly Titanic or, you know, some groundbreaking technical thing, Avatar or anything like that. And and yet it took that long to get the picture made, just because they were afraid that it would just tank at the box office. Um, so you know, Grapes of Wrath is a leap in some ways. There were a lot of films made of classic literature that were very successful, um, and not so classic literature, also which were very successful. Uh, so I don't think it was a gamble. It was a fairly big budget film, and it certainly packed star power. And I think it was a pretty much a good to go at box kind of situation. But it's a good example of a solid studio picture directed by a very solid studio director in a very mainstream way, but still a very successful film. So it's worth our taking a look at.